the best-selling vehicle in Somalia, the best-selling vehicle in Yemen, in large parts of Africa, and in half the Middle East, is a Toyota pickup truck you can order from a dealership for around $30,000. It is also the single most requested vehicle on Earth for anyone trying to fight a war on a shoestring budget. Warlords buy it. National armies buy it. Terrorist propaganda videos are built around it, parked in rows like a car show for the apocalypse. A United States government agency has formally investigated how this vehicle keeps ending up in the hands of terrorists, and Toyota did not stumble into owning both the deserts of Africa and the war zones of the Middle East by accident. This is the story of how a cheap, simple pickup truck became the most feared vehicle in modern conflict, and how Toyota turned that reputation into the most effective market capture strategy in automotive history. Toyota launched the Hilux in 1968 as a replacement for an older, smaller truck called the Brisker. The name itself was short for high luxury, which sounds almost funny in hindsight, because there was nothing glamorous about the truck at all. A steel ladder frame, a simple diesel engine, suspension that could survive being loaded far past its rating and still make it home. Toyota did not build the Hilux to be fast, comfortable, or impressive on a spec sheet. They built it never to stop running, and in markets without paved roads or spare parts stores, that turned out to be the only feature that mattered. By the mid-1970s, the Hilux was already exporting to Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, regions the big American and European manufacturers treated as an afterthought. Ford and General Motors were busy fighting each other over suburban driveways in Detroit. Toyota went to Nairobi, Lagos, and Bangkok instead, and it sold trucks to farmers, construction crews, and small businesses who needed one thing above all else: a vehicle that would not leave them stranded 100 miles from the nearest mechanic. A Hilux engine could be pulled apart and rebuilt with a wrench and a hammer. No computer needed, no dealership required, just a manual and enough patience. Its cousin, the Land Cruiser, was already earning that same reputation a rung higher up the price ladder, and together the two trucks quietly became the default transport of the entire developing world before either one ever made the evening news. That single decision, to engineer for repairability over refinement, quietly built Toyota a reputation across the developing world that no marketing budget could have bought. Long before anyone associated the Hilux with soldiers or gunmen, it was already the default work truck of the entire global south. And that same trait, the one that made it perfect for a farmer with no access to a parts warehouse, was about to make it just as perfect for someone with a very different use for a truck bed. Keep that in mind because it matters a great deal later. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Hilux kept doing exactly what it was built to do. It crossed the Sahara on cargo runs. It hauled produce through the Amazon. It sat parked outside farmhouses in rural Australia for a decade without a single major repair. And it started quietly racking up podium finishes at the Dakar Rally, a race specifically designed to break vehicles apart in the desert over thousands of miles of unforgiving terrain. Toyota was not chasing prestige. It was chasing durability, and durability turned out to be the one thing that mattered most in the parts of the world where infrastructure could not be relied on. A broken-down truck could mean a ruined harvest, or a missed delivery with real financial consequences. If you are enjoying this story so far, do me a favour and hit subscribe, because this is where it gets a lot stranger. The same qualities that made the Hilux beloved by farmers, namely a low centre of gravity, a bed that could carry serious weight, and an engine that ran on diesel available almost anywhere, also made it the ideal platform for something else entirely. Throughout the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, Mujahideen fighters began mounting machine guns onto the beds of pickup trucks, valuing speed and unpredictability over the armour of a real military vehicle. It was a crude idea. Bolt a heavy weapon to a light, fast truck, and you get something a tank cannot easily hit and cannot easily outrun. Nobody at Toyota designed the Hilux with this in mind. But nobody was stopping it either, and across the world's most unstable regions, the truck was quietly becoming something the company had never advertised and could not have predicted. That idea reached its full, brutal expression in 1987, in a conflict that the world would eventually just call the Toyota War. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi had spent years occupying northern Chad, backing rebel factions and building up a conventional force of roughly 11,000 men. backed by Soviet tanks and heavy artillery. Chad's president, Hissène Habré, had a fraction of that firepower. What he had instead was around 400 Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser pickups, fitted with French-made Milan anti-tank missiles and machine guns. At the Battle of Fada in January 1987, a Chadian force of roughly 5,000 men in these trucks attacked a heavily fortified Libyan garrison of 2,000 soldiers backed by tanks and armour. The Libyan forces could not track the trucks fast enough to hit them, and their tanks proved deeply vulnerable to the missiles bolted onto the truck beds. When the battle ended, close to 800 Libyan soldiers were dead. Chad lost 18 men and just 3 of its trucks. By the time the war ended later that year, Libya had lost an estimated 7,500 soldiers and over $1.5 billion in military equipment, all at the hands of a country that had essentially gone to war in pickup trucks. The vehicles used in that fight earned a name that stuck for good. The term technical actually traces back a few years earlier to Somalia, where aid groups paid local militias for protection under the label Technical Assistance Grants, a term that eventually got shortened and attached to the trucks themselves. But it was Chad that proved the concept could win an actual war against a conventional army, and by September 1987, with both sides now fighting each other in captured and purchased Toyotas, a ceasefire finally ended the conflict. Toyota had accidentally created the most influential improvised weapons platform of the late 20th century. But its reputation for toughness was about to be tested in a completely different arena, by a British television host with a wrecking ball and absolutely no mechanical sympathy. In 2003, the British motoring show Top Gear decided to answer a question its producers had been noticing for years. Every time global news footage showed a war zone as jungle expedition or a disaster relief effort, the same battered pickup truck kept turning up in the background, half rusted and still somehow running. Executive producer Andy Willman and his team wondered whether that was a coincidence, or something worth actually testing on camera. So presenter Jeremy Clarkson bought a 15-year-old Hilux with over 190,000 miles on it for around £1,500 straight off a farm and set out to destroy it in front of an audience of millions. They drove it down a flight of concrete steps. They rammed it sideways into the corner of a building hard enough to knock bricks loose. They parked it on a beach and let the tide of the Bristol Channel swallow it for 6 hours. Each time, the crew did nothing but basic repairs with hand tools, and each time the engine turned over. Then they set it on fire, let it burn down to the frame, and started it again. Finally, they placed the wreck on the roof of a tower block scheduled for demolition, and blew the entire building up around it. By any normal measure, the truck should have been scrap metal after the first afternoon. Instead, footage of a scorched, waterlogged, half-crushed Hilux, starting on the first try, became one of the most replayed pieces of car television ever produced. Years later, the same production team took 2 more Hilux trucks to the magnetic North Pole just to see if they could drive there, and both made it. Toyota did not pay for a single second of any of it, and it did more for the brand's reputation than a decade of advertising campaigns could have managed. The Top Gear stunt gave Toyota something money genuinely cannot buy: a viral, third-party proof that its cheapest truck could survive anything, literally. Toyota leaned in immediately, launching a Hilux trim called Invincible not long after the episode aired. Sales in markets far outside the UK ticked upward as the myth of the unstoppable Hilux spread. But that same myth had already been quietly building for 2 decades in a far more dangerous direction. Andrew Exum, a former US Army Ranger and defense analyst, later summed it up for Newsweek in a line that stuck. "It's the vehicular equivalent of the AK-47, he said, and by the 2000s that was not an exaggeration. Taliban fighters in Afghanistan used Hilux and Land Cruiser trucks as their primary mobility platform through the entire war, valuing them for the same reason Chadian forces had 2 decades earlier. Somali militias, some tied to Al-Qaeda, mounted heavy weapons on Toyota beds throughout the 1990s and 2000s, fighting in a civil war that never fully ended. When the Free Syrian Army rose against the Assad government in 2011, Hilux trucks became what one advisor to the Syrian opposition called force enablers, cheap, fast platforms that could carry crew-served machine guns anywhere the fighting moved on short notice. None of this was Toyota's doing directly, and no dealership was knowingly arming a militia. But the same reputation for toughness the company had spent decades earning in farm fields and construction sites was now the reputation an entire generation of the world's irregular fighters quietly relied on, from mountain passes in Afghanistan to city blocks in Mogadishu. And in 2014, that same association was about to become an international incident that Toyota could no longer simply ignore. When ISIS swept across Iraq and Syria in 2014, its propaganda videos looked almost identical from one release to the next. Long convoys of white Toyota pickups, flying black flags, cabs packed with fighters, truck beds loaded with heavy weapons. When ISIS militants paraded through the centre of Raqqa, more than 2/3 of the vehicles in the footage were the same white Toyotas with the black Caliphate emblem painted on the doors. The scale of it stunned diplomats. Lukman Faili, Iraq's ambassador to the United States, said his government believed ISIS had received hundreds of brand new Toyota trucks in a short window of time. "This is a question we've been asking our neighbours," he said. "How could these brand new trucks, these four-wheel drives, hundreds of them, be coming from?" There were a handful of other brands scattered through the footage, a few Mitsubishis, a Hyundai here and there, but they barely registered next to the wall of white Toyotas. The company's own sales figures showed Hilux and Land Cruiser sales in Iraq tripling from around 6,000 units in 2011 to 18,000 in 2013, and nobody could fully explain how so many ended up in the hands of a terrorist army instead of the customers who had actually ordered them. For a company that had spent decades building a reputation for toughness in some of the poorest, most unstable parts of the planet, this was the nightmare version of that same story. The truck built to survive anything was now the truck that symbolized the world's most feared terrorist organization, and the United States government wanted answers. In October 2015, the Terror Financing Unit of the US Treasury Department formally reached out to Toyota, asking the company to help explain how its vehicles kept ending up in ISIS hands. Mark Wallace, a former US ambassador to the United Nations, put the problem in blunt terms. The Land Cruiser and the Hilux, he said, had practically become part of the ISIS brand itself. Toyota's response was calm and carefully worded. The company pointed out that it had already stopped selling vehicles in Syria entirely years earlier, and said it maintained a strict policy against selling to anyone who might use its vehicles for paramilitary or terrorist activity, with procedures in place to protect its supply chains. But Toyota also admitted something uncomfortable. No automaker, the company said, can fully control what happens to a vehicle once it is resold, stolen, or passed through middlemen it has no visibility into. Iraqi officials suspected the trucks were being smuggled across the Syrian border by dealers and middlemen operating far outside Toyota's control. Nobody, including the US government, ever produced a clean public answer for exactly how the supply chain leaked. For any other company, this should have been the moment a beloved product turned into a permanent liability, the kind of headline that forces a brand to distance itself from its own bestseller. A truck that had once symbolized rugged, honest work was now sharing screen time with executions and mass casualty attacks, broadcast to millions. Instead, Toyota had already spent over a decade quietly building something that would make the entire controversy almost beside the point. In 2002, years before ISIS existed, Toyota greenlit a project called IMV, short for Innovative International Multi-Purpose Vehicle. The plan was simple and enormous: build the Hilux and two related vehicles called the Fortuner and the Innova, entirely outside Japan, using shared parts, aimed directly at the markets where reliability mattered more than luxury. Toyota built manufacturing hubs in Thailand, Indonesia, Argentina, and South Africa. Diesel engines came from Thailand, petrol engines came from Indonesia, transmissions came from the Philippines and India. The vehicles rolled out to buyers across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America without ever touching a factory in Japan. Cumulative IMV sales crossed 1 million units by 2006, 5 million by 2012, and kept climbing every year after that. The result was not subtle. The Hilux is now sold in over 190 countries. More than 20 million have been built since 1968. In 2023 alone, Toyota sold 604,000 Hilux trucks worldwide, almost double the number Ford managed with the Ranger, its closest rival. In Australia, the Hilux has spent years as the country's single best-selling vehicle, at one point holding 59% of the entire two-wheel drive market in a single month, outselling the Ranger, the D-Max and the Triton combined. Across Africa, the Middle East, and much of Latin America, in country after country on Toyota's own bestseller list, the top-selling vehicle on the road is a Toyota pickup. Even in 2025, in a country as small as Yemen, the Hilux still held over a third of its own pickup segment despite years of war eroding the market around it. Toyota did not build a truck that accidentally ended up loved by farmers and feared by armies. It built the cheapest, most repairable, most widely manufactured pickup on the planet, placed it directly inside the exact regions where instability made durability the only feature that mattered, and let every war, every insurgency, and every viral British television stunt do its advertising for free. So what actually happened here? It came down to three decisions. First, Toyota engineered for repair, not comfort, which made the Hilux the default vehicle in places with no reliable infrastructure and no forgiving dealer network. Second, Toyota built factories directly inside those same regions through the IMV project, so the truck was never a distant import. It was a local product with local supply chains, local jobs, and local prices that undercut anything shipped in from Detroit or Wolfsburg. Third, and this is the part most companies would never risk, Toyota let the world do its marketing without ever trying to control the story. A war in Chad, a British television host with a wrecking ball, and even a terrorist organisation's propaganda videos all reinforced the same message no ad campaign could have said out loud. This truck cannot be killed. That strategy is not without risk. In Yemen, Toyota's own market share in the Hilux segment has recently slipped as buyers shift toward the militarised Land Cruiser pickup instead. A small reminder that even the most dominant reputation can erode once a war changes shape. But across most of the developing world, the formula still holds decades later. Toyota captured the deserts, the farms, and, unfortunately, the war zones of the entire global south with one simple, ugly, indestructible little truck, and it never had to spend a fortune convincing anyone it was tough. The world already knew, because the world kept building the proof for free. If you want to see how another one of Toyota's vehicles built an entirely different kind of empire, in the deserts of the Middle East instead of the war zones, the story of the Land Cruiser is next, and it might be even stranger than this one.